소위 말하는 선진국들의 통계를 보면은 예상치 못한 상당히 충격적인 교육 통계가 공통적으로 나타나는 경우가 있어요. 남성들의 대학 진학률이 여성들의 대학 진학률과 큰 차이를 보이는데 대체로 여성들의 대학 진학률이 남자보다 한 7, 8% 정도 높게 나타납니다. 우리나라도 찾아보니까 재작년 통계를 보면은 남성의 대학 진학률은 약 69%에서 70% 사이 정도였고 여성의 대학 진학률은 76%에서 77% 사이, 여성들이 남성들보다 한 7% 정도 대학에 가는 경우가 많다라는 통계를 발견했어요. 예전에는 가난한 집안에 애를 한 명밖에 대학에 보낼 수 없는데 남자아이가 여자아이가 있다 그러면 대체로 남자아이를 대학에 보냈죠. 누나나 여동생이 여공이나 또는 알바를 통해서 남동생이나 오빠의 학비를 댔던 얘기가 1970년대 80년대 우리나라 드라마나 소설에도 굉장히 자주 등장했습니다. 이거는 우리나라뿐 아니라 다른 나라들도 마찬가지여서 1950년대 60년대에 대학에 가는 사람들의 대부분은 남자였어요. 하지만 여성의 대학 진학률이 남성의 대학 진학률을 상회하기 시작했고 서구국가들 같은 경우에는 훨씬 더 일찍 1980년대부터 여성들이 남성보다 훨씬 더 많이 대학에 갔다고 합니다. 사회에서 자기 역할을 찾지 못한 사람들에 대한 통계도 있습니다. 사회학자들은 절망사라는 단어를 쓰는데 안타깝게 스스로 목숨을 끊거나 아니면 알코올이나 마약 중독에 빠져서 죽거나 심각한 범죄를 저질러서 영구수감이 돼서 사회적으로는 죽었다고 할 수 있는 사람 등을 다 포함해서 절망사라고 이야기를 해요. 근데 대부분의 서양 선진국에서 절망사의 비율이 남성이 여성보다 4배 가까이 높게 나타났고요. 우리나라 같은 경우에도 특히 중년의 자살률을 보면 남성들이 여성들보다 한 3배 정도 가까이 스스로 안타깝게 극단적인 선택을 하는 걸로 나타났습니다. 오늘 저랑 같이 인터뷰를 진행할 리처드 리브스라는 분은 브루킹스 인스티튜트라는 미국의 대표적인 정책 연구소 중에 하나의 사회학자였는데요. 이분은 굉장히 독특한 프로필이 있어요. 바로 아들을 셋 키운 분이라는 겁니다. 그렇기 때문에 이 미국 사회에서 남자아이들이 크면서 겪게 되는 다양한 사회적 문제라든지 압박 또는 왜 이들이 탈선을 선택하는지에 대한 연구를 볼 때마다 가슴 깊게 꽂혔다고 하고요. 그래서 자라나는 소년들과 그들이 남자가 됐을 때 겪는 그들만의 문제에 대한 Of Boys and Men, 소년과 남자에 대해서라는 책을 써서 미국에서 굉장히 화제가 되기도 했죠. 오늘 리처드 리브스와의 인터뷰를 통해서 왜 나라가 선진국이 될수록 사회 속에서 자신의 자리를 찾지 못하는 남성의 숫자가 늘어나는지에 대해서 줌 인터뷰를 통해서 얘기를 나눠보기로 했습니다.
One of the shocking data point that you mentioned in your book was that all the editor-in-chief of student newspapers at every single Ivy League college was girls at some point. And most of the people dropping out of high school or not going to college, they were boys. After reading your book, I pulled up some statistics from the Department of Gender Equality in Korea. It seems that in 2022, which was the latest data point I could find, 76.6% of girls went to college and only 70.3% of boys did. And then I pulled up some statistics for the recipients of the master's degree. In 2021, 54.5% of master's degree went to women, which meant there were 7,612 more master's degree recipients who were female, which came out to be 9% more than men.
I think the first thing is that South Korea, in terms of the education gap, the gender gap, might be behind some of the other countries where the overtaking took place 10, 20 years ago. In the US, in higher education, even before 2000. But also seeing in the Scandinavian countries, in Western Europe, that overtaking took place, but then just carried on, right? So given everything I know, I would expect South Korea to just follow that pattern and for those gender gaps to just grow now. So there's a couple of things here. One is that boys and young men, they just develop a little bit later on average. Mm-hmm. So I write in the book and just draw on evidence that, particularly around organizational skills, so like the frontal cortex, the bit of your brain that basically makes you turn in your homework and go to bed, right? Make good decisions. That just develops about a year later on average in boys. Mm-hmm. And so if you have an education system that rewards organization, planning, discipline, that's just going to favor girls on average. Jonathan Haidt is co-chair of the advisory council of the American Institute for Boys and Men, the new think tank that I've set up. Mm-hmm. And he and I have worked together quite a lot. I'm a huge admirer of his work, and the restriction in play and movement, especially kind of riskier play, is just bad like across the board, but it's particularly bad for boys. In just the same way that you might see other changes that are bad overall, but particularly bad for girls. So a lot of the social media work that John does around Instagram, TikTok, being worse for girls, I think that's true. But certainly in school and in society generally, the move away from play, movement, physicality, like it's just true that boys are a bit more physical. Right, they need more physical movement, and so if the schools have, as they have, they've reduced how much movement there is, they've reduced recess, they're teaching to the test, they're kind of much more in the sit still and listen mode of teaching. Again, that's bad for girls as well, but it's especially bad for boys, and it's one reason we see this kind of education gap opening up.
이 남학생들의 학업 부진에 대해서 리처드 리브스는 두 가지 이유를 짚어줬는데요. 하나는 학교가 순전히 암기 위주, 입시 위주로 가면 갈수록 남학생들은 부진을 겪을 수밖에 없다라는 이야기를 했습니다. 우리가 당장 놀이터에서 남자애들과 여자애들이 노는 걸 지켜보기만 하더라도 남자애들은 훨씬 더 활동적이죠. 그렇기 때문에 가만히 앉아있어 라는 선생님의 지시를 따르기가 어린 나이에서는 남자애들이 상당히 힘들 수밖에 없다는 얘기를 해요. 그리고 이 학습을 하는 스타일에 있어서도 남자아이들은 활동이라든지 액티비티를 통해서 배우는 것에 훨씬 더 익숙한데, 이제 미국 교육이 점점 가만히 앉아서 선생님이 설명해 주는 얘기를 답습하고 복습하고 시험을 보는 것 위주, 즉 약간 우리나라 같은 입시 위주 교육으로 가면서 남자아이들이 학교는 재미없어, 정말 답답한 곳이야 라고 생각하게 되는 경우가 많아졌다고 합니다.
If you find that part of your role is to be like the play dad, sometimes this is used as a criticism of men and fathers, is that like, you just play with him, right? The mums, we do all the hard work, right? We do the cleaning and the cooking, right? And you just play with him. Play between fathers and sons is massively important for development. There's even this evidence, this is the best study I have found in recent years, that dad jokes are good for kids.
Oh, wow.
Which is great for me. I mean, I could give you another hour of dad jokes if you want. It turns out that kind of it's good for kids, for dads to tell jokes. But play, actually just playing and jumping and kind of running around and stuff and getting them to laugh, that helps you bond because you don't have the same hormones that kind of that the women get, that mums get. And so one of the ways that dads bond with the kids is by playing with them, tickling them, giggling, laughing, etc. Like if you're having fun playing, not only is that going to help you kind of be a dad, but also that is parenting. Play is not the opposite of parenting. It's a central part of parenting.
이 남학생들의 학업 부진에 대해서 리처드 리브스는 또 두 번째 이유로 학교 안에서 남학생들이 우러러볼 만한 남성 롤 모델이 드물어졌다. 남자 선생님들의 숫자가 너무 적다라는 이야기도 합니다. 초등학교 같은 경우에는 원래 남성 교사보다 여성 교사의 숫자가 압도적으로 높았지만 미국 같은 경우에는 그 트렌드가 중고등학교까지 퍼져서 중고등학교에서도 거의 교사가 여성인 경우가 많다고 합니다. 근데 여학생들 같은 경우에는 선생님이 남성이건 여성이건의 영향을 받지 않는데요, 학업에. 근데 남자아이들 같은 경우, 특히 학업에 어려움을 느끼는 중위권 이하의 학생들 같은 경우에는 남자 선생님이 있을 때 여자 선생님이 있을 때보다 학교를 그만두거나 공부를 포기하지 않을 가능성이 훨씬 더 높아진다고 얘기를 해요. 사춘기는 제2의 성장이 도래하면서 성욕이 발동하는 시기인데 성욕을 건강한 쪽으로 돌리는 방법을 배우지 못한 경우에 그럴 수가 있고요. 두 번째는 공격성. 뭐만 하면 화가 나고 막 뭔가 치고 싶고 소리 지르고 싶고 이런 감정을 어떻게 컨트롤해서 학교에서 적응을 하느냐. 그리고 남학생들이 훨씬 더 학교에서 자기네들끼리 뭔가 다칠 수 있는 위험한 놀이를 하는 경우가 많고 그것을 못하게 했을 때 뭔가 통제를 받거나 억압을 받는다고 느껴서 반항을 하는 경우가 더 많다고 해요. 여선생님들이 직접 공감이 가게 지도해 주기가 무척이나 어려운 부분이기 때문에 이런 학생들이 편하게 터놓고 얘기할 수 있는 상대가 줄어드는 것도 큰 요인이라고 짚었습니다.
Before reading your book, I didn't know that something like 80%, it was higher, wasn't it? It was like 92% of primary school teachers are female.
Yeah, fewer than 1 in 10 in the US. I don't know what the figures are in Korea or elsewhere. And of course, it's always been a bit more female, but it's just becoming much, much more female. What's interesting is that secondary school didn't used to be so female, at least in the US, and it is becoming so. So whereas elementary school has always been more female, it's becoming more so. Secondary school, high school didn't, but that is now becoming very female as well. And that's a new thing. That's a big change.
You said in your book that for a female student, their performance didn't vary according to whether they had a male or a female teacher. But for a male student, their academic scores improved if they had a male teacher. As a father of 3 boys, why do you think that is?
Well, the first thing to say is that there's still a lot of research going on this question. And there are some studies, including a new one that's a little bit less clear about the effect of male teachers. So I just want to be honest about that. But where you do see evidence that it seems to affect boys more, there's some evidence that male teachers just deal a little bit differently with behavior issues among boys. They're a little bit less likely to immediately punish boys or expel them from the classroom. They just give them a little bit more room, maybe because they're men. They understand sometimes more easily that kind of behavior is just a bit more natural in a boy. So if a boy's struggling to sit still, for example, like he's jumping up and down, right? How do you react? Do you discipline immediately, or do you say, okay, I get it, run around the class a couple of times and then come back and then we'll all sit down again, right? And it just looks like male teachers are a little bit better at understanding the fact that boys do struggle on average a bit more with sitting still.
특히 젊은 남성과 남학생들을 사회에서 이탈하게 만드는 큰 요인으로 모티베이션 갭이라는 것도 있다고 합니다. 이 모티베이션 갭은 동기부여 격차라는 거예요. 더 이상 사회에서 열심히 일하거나 참여를 할 동기를 찾지 못하고 있는 경우가 나라가 선진국이 될수록 늘어난다는 거죠. 1960년대, 70년대 같은 경우에는 남자라면 어느 정도 공부를 열심히 하고 사회적 지위를 차지해서 당당하게 내가 좋아하는 이성한테 프로포즈를 할 만한 어떤 능력을 갖추고 그 사람과 결혼해서 아이의 학비를 벌면서 살아가는 것이 남자의 인생이다 라는 모델이 있었고, 이 모델이 굉장히 강력했다고 합니다. 하지만 이제 1990년대, 2000년대, 2010년대에 오면서 1인 가족의 수도 많아지고 우리나라 같은 경우에도 아이를 안 낳는 사람의 숫자도 많아지고 이런 전통 가족이 붕괴되면서 내가 왜 일을 해야 되지? 라고 물어보면 스스로 답을 못 찾는 경우가 굉장히 많아졌다고 해요.
I'm much more worried about the men who are checking out than the men who are acting out. So there are some men who are acting out, but mostly it's men just checking out and lacking some of that aspiration and ambition. Now, it might be that it's this generation of women or the two generations of women who've just been told, female empowerment, you go girl. They've had this very strong message about empowerment. Mm-hmm. And that's been, in my view, magnificent, wonderful. But there's been obviously no equivalent message for boys because we've just assumed, well, they don't need it, right? Because the world's supposed to be made for them. The world's a patriarchy. They'll be fine. And I think that assumption's wrong. Mm-hmm. And absent that any kind of messages of uplift or empowerment for boys and men, and they've just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, why would I work hard? Especially if you see the rise in South Korea of these of women saying, look, I'm not going to get married, I'm not going to have a boyfriend, I'm not going to have kids. And I think your country is one of the most interesting in the world in terms of the relationship between young men and young women and fertility and marriage and so on, and just not feeling like their interests are aligned. And not feeling, a lot of young men feeling like they're going to be needed, which is we falsely believe that boys need less nurturing and love than girls. And the opposite is true. All the evidence is that actually boys need a bit more nurturing and love, if anything. The good thing about the old world is that men were told very clearly, well, you need to go make money. Mm-hmm. You're going to need to raise a family. And if you want a wife and kids and a family, then you better get out there and work and study, right? That was good in a way. I don't think the whole system was good because it was very unequal. We've taken away the old motivation for men, which was based on that kind of old, more patriarchal world, and we haven't replaced it. But for women, we've taken the old story, you're going to be a nurse, you're going to be a wife, you're going to be a mother, and we've replaced it with a you can be anything you want. You can be CEO. And I think it's just left a lot of men thinking like not seeing their role, not seeing their place. And above all, not knowing if they are going to be needed. And I have come to the view that not being sure if you're needed or if you're going to be needed is literally fatal in some cases. I think it leads to drug overdoses or suicides, but I also think it's just sort of culturally fatal in the sense that it just saps you of ambition and aspiration. I really do think that one of the main things that motivates all of us is the sense that other people need us. Other people are relying on us. And if you're a young man and you're not sure that's going to be true.
If you look at the higher end of the societal spectrum, men are actually doing much better than women, right? So if you look at most of Fortune 500 CEOs, they're men. If you look at the US senators, they're men. So it's very easy for somebody whose aspiration is to join the ranks of the CEOs or the senators, who has a great education, who comes from a middle class or upper middle class background. It's easier for them to look around and say, hey, the world hasn't changed yet. I think was the most important message in your book was that the gender works differently across your socioeconomic class. So you said if you look at the bottom half of the population, the women, obviously, they're struggling as well in the bottom half of the population, but they're barely holding on. whereas a lot of men are just falling through the cracks and,
Right.
into this bottomless pit of despair. And I learned the word death of despair from your book. I didn't know that this expression existed. You were talking about how, most people in prison, they're men. Most of the people who are drug addicts or die of alcoholism, they're men. People who take their own lives, most of them are men. Why do you think this is happening?
Your point about like the apex and the top of society still being male dominated is hugely important. And actually, this term patriarchy gets thrown around a lot, right? Patriarchy in its original definition is about a small group of men controlling everybody else. It's not about all men being better off than all women, right? It's more of a class point. Most of the people in positions at the top of society are still men. And that's a bit less true in the US today than it was, for sure, a lot less. We're making progress. But it is still true that it male skews, but that doesn't have any bearing at all on what it's like to be in the bottom half of the population. These deaths of despair, particularly from drugs and suicide, much, much more male. And it does look like, as you say, like the women are doing a bit better, even as they struggle more in those poorer areas. I think there's two reasons why. One, I'll give you the kind of policy wonk answer, and then the sort of cultural answer. The policy wonk answer is that the women are typically the ones who still have responsibility for the children. And that means they get welfare. That means they get more support from the government. That means they're kind of getting income transfers, they're getting healthcare, etc. Right? All because of the children. And so if they're single, it's not the same. The second thing is that just culturally, if it's a situation where there are children and the father is not in the child's life or doesn't feel responsible for the child in some way, then his motivation to work and to remain in employment, to stay off drugs, is just much less. Whereas the mum is like, this kid's relying on me, so I'm going to really try. And so I do think that one of the consequences of the sort of breakdown of traditional marriage is to sort of detach fathers from that sense of responsibility for their kids. And that's a big problem that we need to address. And I don't think we're not going to go back to the old world of marriage, but I do think that if you look at a lot of the men who are struggling the most, they're the ones who don't have children, or more likely they've lost touch with their children. And so they don't feel their children need them. They may not feel like society needs them. And so they are much, much more vulnerable to drugs and suicide. And so, for just one data point on it, men in the US are 4 times more likely to take their own lives by suicide, but divorced men are more likely to take their own lives than divorced women. And so separation and divorce is just catastrophic for the mental health, suicide rates, drug use of men. So becoming a father is this huge turning point. I know it's happened to me 3 times.
In South Korea, we have one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. We have more people living by themselves in a single family household than probably any developed country in the world. It's bearing on 40% now. They're still living the free life, drinking great coffee. But when they hit 40, 50, maybe how they will fare, there might be a serious social problem. And it does show on the data. So after reading your book, I saw the gender suicide rates in Korea. What's surprising in the Korean data was that for teens, there was no difference between men and women in terms of number of children tragically taking their own lives. But when they're between 20 and 29, the rate becomes 1.5 times more for men than for women. But when you go up in the age group and you reach 30 to 39, then now men die at twice the rate as women from suicide. And then when they reach 50 or 60, then it's 3 times. It never gets to 4 times or 8 times that you said in the US or the UK.
And it's one of the reasons why people are so interested in South Korea. But with that fertility rate and with this really big gap between young men and young women that we see, I do think that thinking through what will that look like for men in their 30s, 40s, etc., who typically, if they're childless, really do much worse than the women, even the women who are childless, right? And so the question then is like, what kind of social institutions are going to be needed? Because there's because of loneliness. How do we make men, in particular, in their 30s and their 40s and their 50s, feel purposeful, feel needed, feel connected, right? You might be thinking about like big voluntary programs to have them coaching in schools, or I don't know what the movement would be, the Scout movement or something. But if I'm a policymaker, I'm thinking ahead and thinking, how do we try to construct ways to make this growing pool of childless men feel connected to society and feel useful? If they don't, across human history, childless men have been a problem. And previously, they would go to war or go off exploring. I mean, one of the facts that absolutely startled me when I was doing this work was to discover that we have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. Did you know that?
But I can imagine so, because if you look at history, polygamy was rather common.
Right.
And if there was a great emperor with 5,000 wives, then unless that particular society just produced a lot of daughters, obviously a lot of men couldn't pass over their genes. So
Right. You got there quickly. Most people go like, wait, hang on. Right. That's exactly right. And of course, the famous examples are like Genghis Khan or that Irish king. Like 10% of the Irish population are descended from one king. But yeah, so across human history, men have had about a 50% chance of reproducing. Right. It's basically been a coin toss whether they reproduce or not. And so it's in their interest to take a lot of risks, to go to war or, try a big crime or something to try and get up the hierarchy, right? To try and become something other than an evolutionary dud. And so it's one of the evolutionary explanations for the higher risk appetite of men is that actually it's just worth it to take risks. Because if you're going to die out anyway, then, risking your own body makes sense. Whereas for women, actually, your body is the thing that's going to reproduce. Almost certainly. And so you really want to protect your body. And as a society, we want to protect that too. We don't need that many men from a reproduction point of view, right? And that's a kind of really sharp and deep truth about human societies is that we just don't need that many men. And so we've always had all these surplus men. And dealing with those surplus men has just been a constant challenge for every human culture. And one of the things that really became important, here I'm drawing on Joe. Do you know Joe Henrich's work? He writes about weird people.
we had Joe Henrich on my show 2 months ago because he speaks about the cultural differences between East and the West. So
he does.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that episode, but I strongly recommend it, even without having seen it, because I think I know you a bit and I know him a bit. And so, but he calls it the problem of surplus men. And then along came this idea of monogamy, this idea that it would be like one man and one woman. And that's this radical new modern idea, which was then really enforced by Christianity in the West. And it had a huge effect because suddenly, like, the move away from polygamy basically almost dealt with this problem of all these surplus men. Because if it was one-on-one, you didn't have all these surplus men. But now, with the rise of women's economic independence, which is great, but it also means that they don't need men. So then you've got to think about, okay, what does the world look like when the women don't need men? And it starts to look a little bit like a world where you might have surplus men.
거의 대부분의 민주 국가들은 세대에 따라서 정치 성향이 조금씩 달라요. 우리나라도 마찬가지고요. 근데 지금처럼 한 세대 안에서 여성과 남성의 정치 성향이 극단적으로 반대로 다는 경우는 민주주의가 정착된 역사 이후로 처음 있는 일이라고 해요. 최소한 옛날에는 한 세대가, 특히 젊은 세대가 야, 옛날 세대와 다른 우리 세대만의 어떤 새로운 세상을 만들자라는 합의를 가지고 세상을 점점 좋게 발전시켜 나갔다는 거예요. 근데 한 세대 안에서 여자가 잘 살면은 남자가 못 살게 된다. 남자가 잘 살면 여자가 못 살게 된다라는 식으로 서로의 이해관계가 반대된다라는 사고를 가지고 있는 사회가 과연 정상적인 민주국가로서 돌아갈 수 있느냐? 우리의 모든 조직들은 다 남성과 여성이 협력을 해야 돌아가는 조직인데 이들이 서로 적으로 생각하는 이런 트렌드가 얼마나 우리 사회의 위험한지에 대해서 따끔하게 비판을 하죠.
This growing gap within the generation, the younger generation, the under 30s around politics is a new phenomenon. And it's much more advanced in South Korea than in some other countries. And also in South Korea, it's being driven by the move of men to the right as much as the move of women to the left. Whereas in most other countries like the UK and the US, it's being more driven so far by the movement of young women more to the left than of men to the right. But in the US, you are now seeing more young men moving to the right. And that's really interesting as to kind of why that's happening. That what's happening here is it's the political expression of some real cultural distance. This is actually that young men and young women increasingly don't see their interests as aligned with each other within a generation. They see their interests as opposed to each other within the generation. And that troubles me for all kinds of reasons. I think if we're going to form families and friendships and have kids and, build our society as a generation, it's pretty good to feel like we're in it together as men and women. And so I think this expression of like women saying more left and men saying more right isn't really so much a left-right issue in a way. I think it's more just a reaction to the others. And then they kind of feed off each other, right? In the end, I'm not partisan. I don't have a sort of sense of like ordinary politics about this. a reasonable question of, well, is it a bad thing if men are becoming more conservative? Why is that bad? I think it's a fair question. It is bad, though, if they're becoming more reactionary. It is bad if young men are starting to think the only way they can flourish is if young women do worse. And it is bad if young women think, I can only succeed in a patriarchal society if young men are suffering, right? And so they need the other side to fail in order for them to succeed. That is profoundly wrong, profoundly damaging. Yeah, I've been watching the politics in your country for a few years now, and I'm seeing similar patterns now following elsewhere. And I do think that the gender dimension of it has been hugely understated, especially in the US.
The risk of ending our conversation here is some people might be listening and they say, okay, the men are screwed. Let's all go home. And then we accomplished nothing. But it seems that you are actually taking some concrete actions in order to improve the lots of boys and men. What are some of the actions that you're engaging now that you think might be pertinent to other countries that are going through similar problems?
Yeah, well, thank you for allowing me the chance to end on a positive note, because this can be like the Book of Lamentations, right? It's just all woe is me, like a secular equivalent of that anyway. And I don't do that in the book. And the fact that I've set up a think tank and institute is, you're right, it's a sign of hope. I think the first thing is to raise awareness of these problems in just like a non-political way, in the way that you and I have in this conversation. Look, just so that people know. I think it's very important to know that these problems are there and they're real, based on good research, good data. Because you can't solve a problem until people agree that it's a problem. So there is some work to do still to raise awareness. But then the second thing is, okay, so let's say there's wide agreement now that the education system's just not working very well for boys in the US. A lot of agreement. Okay, so what do we do? Well, we're looking at trials of like more male teachers. We're looking at vocational training tracks. And why does it, like vocational training seems to work better for boys. So we need more technical high schools in the US, and we need to fund them better, because just on average, those seem to work a bit better for boys. Maybe boys should start school a bit later or go to college a little bit later, just to give them that extra time, 6 months or a year to just develop a little bit more, because they are a little bit behind in terms of brain development. Maybe we should be doing that. Maybe we should be offering scholarships to men to go into teaching and into the mental health professions where there are kind of fewer and fewer men. Maybe we should have policies that really encourage men to take paid leave to be fathers, right? Have paid leave for dads. And there's really good evidence that works in terms of helping men feel more important as fathers. Maybe we need some really male-specific mental health policies, especially around suicide and drug overdose, which is where most of the men are, and especially more male social workers. Like social work, we haven't talked about that, but social work is an area that's also becoming very, very, very female. But a lot of the clients are male, right? And so actually we need more male social workers to help work with men with drug addiction problems. Most homeless people are men. And so I just think making those professions a bit more male friendly would be good as well. But the truth is that like some of this, we're still in the early stages of figuring out what works and what doesn't work. I'm just excited about the fact that we're realizing that there's a problem here and that my institute is attracting some attention and some support. It is time to get serious about that, not only in terms of pointing out the problems, but then coming up with and implementing serious solutions. And simply by signaling that we want solutions and that we're working on solutions, that sends an incredibly powerful message to boys and young men, which is, we're working on this. We see you. We see the problems. We got you. Right now, many of them feel like we are not taking their problems seriously. We lack empathy, and that makes them very vulnerable to the people who come along and look for someone to blame.
고통은 비교할 수도 없고 비교할 이유도 없다라는 말이 있죠. 내가 어떤 힘든 일을 겪고 있는데 옆에 있는 사람이 와가지고 내가 더 힘들어 라고 얘기하면 내 기분만 더 나빠지지, 저 사람이 더 힘들다 그래서 내가 덜 힘들어지는 게 아니죠. 사실 사회가 잘 돌아가려면 서로가 각자의 힘듦이 있다는 걸 인정을 하고 그 힘듦을 어떻게 하면 최소화할까 고민을 해나가야만 사회가 더 좋아지는 게 아닌가라고 생각을 하게 만들어준 책이 리처드 리브스와 같이 얘기한 Of Boys and Men 이라는 책이 아닌가 싶어요. 근데 이상하게 우리가 개개인의 일일 때는 어떤 사람이 힘들고 해서 내가 더 힘들거든 이렇게 얘기를 하지 않지만, 내가 속한 집단이 다른 집단과 같이 얘기를 하게 되면은 누가 더 많은 고통을 받고 있는지에 대한 경쟁으로 이 이야기가 흘러가는 경우가 많습니다. 제가 리처드 리브스와의 대화, 그리고 그 책을 통해서 배운 가장 중요한 것은, 이 사회에서는 여러 가지 이유로 힘든 사람들이 여기저기에 있고 그 모든 힘듦이 다 힘들다는 것을 인정해야만 우리가 다 같이 덜 힘든 방향으로 나아갈 수 있다는 메시지가 아니었나 생각이 돼요. 오늘 조승은의 탐구생활은 여기서 마무리하고요. 다음번에는 더 재밌는 역사 문화 이야기로 찾아뵙겠습니다. 안녕히 계십시오.